We're going to get started today. Hi, thank you all for coming. I'm Sharon Weiner. I teach in the U.S. Foreign Policy Program. It's my pleasure to introduce Stephen Tankel, who came to us all the way from down at SBA, where he's in the Justice, Law, and Society program. We're really pleased to have him here today. He is an expert in terms of research writing, public service on issues about terrorism, insurgency, the evolution of various different non-state actors in these capacities. And I was looking at the classes he's teaching that are on his bio. So I was going to talk to you about how you could take his classes about terrorism and security studies, and then I just learned you actually can't, because starting in January he's going to be on leave for a year working for the Defense Department. Maybe the next year, right? So without further delay, Stephen Tankel.
Sharon, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and June, thank you to both for having me over here. Thank you all for coming out. I see a couple of familiar faces, which is, it's not, and my students are in the front row, so that's good, because, that way they figure if they're not in class tonight, I'll have seen them here today. But thank you, the rest of you, for coming out. When Sharon reached out to me about this, she said that she was interested in bringing people in to talk about, especially policy-relevant research, how we do research that is both academically rigorous but also informs policy. And I had a couple of different topics that came to mind, and you'll see that I'm going to be talking primarily about sort of the future of al-Qaeda and the role of the state, by which I mean the local state in which a jihadist group is based in their interactions with them. I should note, and I was saying to Sharon outside, that one of the pitfalls of doing policy-relevant research, of course, is that it can quickly become dated. So what I'm talking about today is for a book that I am in the process of working on that actually comes from my PhD dissertation. Now, when I started doing my PhD dissertation back in like 2006, 2007, the idea that jihadist groups were not uniform, that they were not deterrable, that they were not strategic actors, was actually somewhat novel, and I sort of patted myself on the back for doing something that I thought was going to be cutting edge. And then, of course, fast forward to like 2012, when you're working on turning your dissertation into a book, and the U.S. counterterrorism strategy actually says jihadist groups are not uniform, and they can be deterred. So whereas I could probably pull a bunch of good articles out of this for a book that people would actually buy, I was sort of forced to think hard about what the next iteration of that is. And for me, that was, okay, yes, it's easy to say all politics is local, they're not uniform. But is there an essential variable that informs their behavior? And there is, and that is the role of the state. Which is to say they're products of their environment, but their behavior is shaped both by the actions of the local state, writ large, and also specifically by the relationship that a jihadist group has with the state where it is domiciled. Okay? And that actually will inform, I hope, not just sort of the academic literature, but also some policy going forward. And we'll talk about that at the end. But anyway, the key takeaway up front is that jihadism may be a transnational phenomenon, but jihadist groups are hardly deterritorialized. Okay? So, in short, states matter. I want to do three things. First, I want to just sort of provide a brief overview in terms of the state's role in formation of jihadist groups' objectives and approach, including major developments after 9/11. Talk a bit about where AQ fits into this and what we mean by al-Qaeda as a territorialized versus transnational phenomenon. And then finally, come to why I think this matters. There were two main jihadist currents, each animated by a cause that engaged with the state in very different ways before 9/11. The first included those who embraced a revolutionary cause to overthrow impious Muslim regimes, which we often term the near enemy, i.e. they were close to these groups. Those predominated in the Middle East and North Africa. The second current was primarily pan-Islamist and predominated in the Persian Gulf and Pakistan. Those who are fighting for a pan-Islamist cause are preoccupied with liberating Muslim territory. They place a premium on fighting external enemies rather than the internal near enemy. And they emphasize the need for internal unity in the face of foreign aggression. It's actually possible to view them in some ways as macro-nationalist. Unlike revolutionaries who typically formed proper groups, those who joined pan-Islamist campaigns, Afghanistan against the Soviets, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Chechnya, Tajikistan during the 1990s, Afghanistan and Iraq again during the past decade, often did so as individuals rather than as members of an organization. And Pakistan is actually the only country to boast proper pan-Islamist groups, which is to say to have people organized together with a hierarchy, leadership, cadre, different wings of an organization, and to fight foreign infidel, in their eyes, forces rather than against the state where they're found. So that's, to me, an important distinction. Now, it should be clear, pan-Islamists engage differently with Muslim states than do revolutionaries, and this historically has been a source of tension between the two of them. Whereas target selection is a question of priorities for revolutionary jihadists, which is to say, we think that fighting against local, impious or apostate Muslim regimes is more important than trying to evict, occupiers. And as a tangent, these guys are hardcore enough about it that one of their ideological pioneers actually said, I would rather not have Jerusalem liberated than have impious regimes liberate it, because then that would enable them to strengthen their cause. So that's what we're talking about here, right? They think fighting foreign forces is important, but not nearly as important as that near enemy. Those who are motivated by pan-Islamism often view fighting against Muslim rulers as a violation of Islamic law. So there's a real distinction in terms of how these two entities view the state, okay? And that's really at the heart of the divide between them, which is either we're all in this together against the kuffar, the infidels, right, the non-Muslims, or you are not Muslim enough for me, and therefore I got to take you down. Okay, and that, again, it's an important distinction. Now, al-Qaeda develops, and I'll talk more about al-Qaeda in a moment, but I just sort of want to put its ideology out there now, partly as a means to try to join these twain during the 1990s. It's explicitly anti-American, and it prioritizes attacking the U.S. and its allies anywhere in the world. It frames this as a pan-Islamist cause. The U.S. puts forces in Saudi Arabia after 1991. Anybody tell me what happened in 1991? The Gulf War. Some of you probably weren't born in 1991. I don't even want to get into that. I remember it quite well. The Gulf War, exactly. Now, Osama bin Laden's fresh off of, what he perceives to be this Arab victory against the Soviets in Afghanistan, which was like nothing of the sort. This was Afghans who, waged an insurgency that were victorious and had enjoyed a lot of support from the U.S., Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and a whole host of other countries. But in bin Laden's mind, he's got this little army of men, and he comes to the Saudi regime and he says, you don't need the U.S. to come and defend you against Saddam Hussein. I can do that. I've got like 40,000 men under arms. And, the Saudi rulers who meet with him are pretty much like, look, they have tanks and it's a desert and you're not going to be able to really wage the kind of insurgency that you thought you would, and we've got a superpower in our corner. And P.S., who's going to command these guys? What, we're going to just have 40,000 Islamists come and camp in our territory? We might have some internal concerns about how they're used afterwards. So bin Laden is greatly spurned, and the U.S. bases out of Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden paints this as a, quote, occupation, which is an interesting conception of occupation, right? Because the U.S. was invited. Be that as it may, from bin Laden's perspective, this is an occupation. And so therefore, he frames this idea of global jihad as a pan-Islamist cause. In reality, it is very much driven by his relations with the Saudi state and by his perceptions of what would or would not be feasible once U.S. forces were based there. Now, what do I mean by that? First of all, bin Laden's ticked off. Okay, let's just be clear about that. A lot of this is just bin Laden is ticked off, and I don't want to sort of put the man on the couch, but that is happening. But he also looks at this and he surmises that, okay, the Saudi state has invited in the U.S. They are clearly infidels, and at some point they will now need to be toppled. but I'm not going to be able to topple them because the US is there. And then he sort of projects his understanding of the Saudi situation onto all the other revolutionary jihads that are happening at the time. In Egypt, in Libya, in Algeria, etc., where he says none of you are going to be able to be successful in your insurgencies because the US is allied with those governments. And so therefore, the important thing is to boot the US out of the region. And then all of these guys are going to fall like dominoes. Okay? This overlooks the fact that back in the early to mid-1990s, the US was actually not that closely allied with any of these regimes and had conducted outreach to some of the Islamist actors that were fighting against the regime, and those in Europe were even hosting them in their countries. In any event, that is sort of how global jihadism, what AQ promotes, develops in a nutshell. It's necessary to drive the US out to topple these apostate regimes, and on top of that, AQ spends a lot of the 1990s not fighting against the US, but actually supporting all these different revolutionary causes. All right? Now, before turning to sort of post-9/11 environment and more broadly AQ's development, I am interested in sort of the role of the state. So I just want to briefly touch on what shaped those revolutionary versus pan-Islamist currents during the 1990s. Because you get very, very different experiences in Saudi Arabia, right, where you get a lot of individuals going to participate in the Afghan jihad, the jihad in Tajikistan, the jihad in Bosnia-Herzegovina, from the experiences in Pakistan, where you have actual groups who are supported by the state, from the regimes in the Middle East and North Africa, specifically Syria and then Egypt, Algeria, and Libya, where they face these revolutionary insurgencies. Saudi's support for pan-Islamism, okay, which is defined here as, actually, does anybody know it? Anybody want to take a crack at pan-Islamism? Anybody from one of my classes? No? Okay. So pan-Islamism is essentially this idea of identifying with the imagined community of Muslim believers known as the Ummah, which is that your identity is not rooted in one particular state or locality, but reaches across the entire world wherever Muslims are, although pan-Islamists generally have a very good idea of what does and does not constitute Muslim territory. Moreover, the idea of Islamism versus Islamic suggests a political connotation. To be pan-Islamic is just to sort of identify with everybody. To be pan-Islamist is to identify with the Ummah, but also to have a political agenda, which is to say that you think governance in different areas of Muslim territory should be along the lines of Islamic law. Okay, so there's a political component there. Saudi Arabia supports pan-Islamism beginning in the 1960s and 70s for both internal and geopolitical reasons. So it's promoting this frame, this concept among its populace. And it's doing this in part to counter Egypt's and Syria's pan-Arabism. And pan-Arabism was essentially the idea that we are all one Arab people, okay, transcending national boundaries. But the religion was put aside. And Saudi Arabia, in its jockeying to be a stronger power in the region, countered with pan-Islamism. So it had a specifically religious connotation to Egypt and Syria's pan-Arabism. Very, very different. Something else happens in 1979 alongside the Soviet invasion that encourages Saudi Arabia to promote Wahhabi Salafism. That's the sect of Islam that is practiced there more broadly. Anybody have any idea of what happens in 1979? Yes?
The Iranian Revolution?
That is exactly right, the Iranian Revolution. So Saudi Arabia is sort of, deems itself the most important Sunni state, and Iran is a Shia state. I'm not going to get into the whole backstory, but Sunni and Shia have a long history of not playing nicely in the sandbox, okay? Saudi Arabia sees Iran's Shia theocracy on the rise and seeks to counter that. How does it counter that? By exporting Wahhabism. by promoting pan-Islamism among Sunni states throughout the region. There's also an internal component to this, which is we're talking about a monarchy, all right, in which there is a important relationship between the ruling regime and the ulama, the group of Muslim scholars. But occasionally you get people who even think, that Saudi Arabia is not perhaps Muslim enough. And so by positioning themselves as sort of the vanguard of promoting Islam throughout the world, it's a way of checking that internal dissent, sort of absorbing it and redirecting it outwards rather than just cracking down on it, which, as we'll see in a moment, is the way other states have approached this. And finally, I should mention that in addition to doing things like promoting virtue and condemning vice, all the things that Islamists would want in Saudi Arabia, economic conditions are also good because oil. Pakistan's support for pan-Islamist groups is of a different but similar vintage. It dates back to partition from India in 1947 when proxies were used in the first of several wars against India. These non-state actors were called mujahideen, holy warriors, okay, and this was labeled as jihad. Thereafter, Pakistan as a new state with a lot of different ethnic groupings used Islam to bind the state together in the face of an external Hindu threat. So remember I talked about pan-Islamism is all about it's us versus them. Well, this is sort of us versus them on steroids. Because Pakistan is saying we are smaller, we are facing a Hindu threat, we all need to get together. We all need to identify not as Punjabis or Sindhis or Baluch, those are the different provinces, some of the different provinces in Pakistan, right? But as Muslims. And more than that, as Muslims who are facing an aggressive Hindu threat. Now, the Soviet presence in Afghanistan, beginning in 1979, does pose an actual threat to Pakistan. I'm happy to get into that during the Q&A. But Pakistan also spies an opportunity to undercut Pashtun nationalism, which India has stoked. That's another ethnicity in Pakistan. By using pan-Islamism and to place a friendly regime in Kabul. And so it is more than happy to support the Afghan Mujahideen and to solicit U.S. assistance and Saudi assistance to do so. But it also begins taking these different actors who are going to fight in Afghanistan and encouraging them to form proper groups, or at least not discouraging them from doing so. So whereas you had a lot of Saudis coming and fighting in Afghanistan just as individuals, in Pakistan, the state encourages them to form into organizations. And then it uses them in Kashmir, Indian-administered Kashmir, where a conflict erupts in 1988, 1989. And it supports them, a lot. And I'm happy to get into what that state support looks like afterwards. But this is state-supported pan-Islamist jihadism. There's no question about it. Now, very quickly on the regimes in the Middle East and North Africa, very, very, very different engagement by the state with these different actors. First, we're talking about single-party authoritarian states that failed to live up to their economic promises. Egypt and Syria, as I said, promoted pan-Arabism rather than Islam. Islamic activism actually became a vehicle for political discontent. Okay, and this refusal to govern by Islamic law as some of these different regimes had promised. Now, how did these regimes respond? Well, a couple of them initially actually built up some of these Islamist groups to counter challenges from leftists and socialists, etc. But then they quickly cracked down on them. Others just cracked down straight away. All right. So the approach there was when you had Islamist activism that maybe was sometimes tinged with violence, but often wasn't. It was more of a social movement, that the state responded to this with brute force, putting a lot of people in prison, in Egypt hanging a few of them here and there, forcing them into exile. Very, very, very different approach than what we see in the Gulf or Pakistan, right? And then, of course, pan-Arabism flops just spectacularly when it comes to wars against Israel, which the Arab states lose repeatedly. Now, what's interesting about revolutionary jihadists is they're overwhelmingly focused on local affairs. If you look at their texts, they talk a lot about socioeconomic issues, local injustices. I know one scholar who interviewed these guys, and their most common complaint, these were Egyptians, said that, if Sadat, the leader who was assassinated, he pledged to Islamize the state, and then he didn't do so even symbolically, right? That was like their big complaint. But you couldn't overlook the fact that Pan-Arabism had failed to liberate Israel, and so a lot of these revolutionaries, what they were saying is, look, Islam is the solution for socioeconomic problems, we'll govern better, we won't be corrupt, and the reason why we keep losing to Israel is that we're not Muslim enough, we're not Islamic enough, and if we were, then we wouldn't lose to Israel. But these impious leaders at the top are not properly motivated. They just want to be fat and happy and corrupt. So again, that's where that's the state's role in forming all of this. And again, al-Qaeda argued that the way to change this system in these different Arab regimes was to evict the U.S. Revolutionaries up until this stage had essentially said, we need to focus on the near enemy. We need to focus on these guys who are, have dominion over us. We think that they are puppets of the U.S. and the West, but we don't think that we should fight the U.S. and the West. We think that the first step has to be to get rid of these apostate rulers, and then, everything is going to get better. It was not, by the way, the most well thought out strategy. I often at this point like to pause and ask if people are familiar with the David Petraeus, it was briefed in a slide that David Petraeus, the underwear gnomes from South Park. Does anybody know what that is? Anybody want to? Okay, fine. I feel like people do, but they don't actually want to come forward. So this was actually briefed in a slide to General David Petraeus. There's a South Park episode where you have the underwear gnomes, and step one for the underwear gnomes is collect a lot of underwear, and step two, big question mark, and step three, get rich. That's a little bit what we're talking about here. Step one, overthrow impious rulers. Step two, question mark. Step three, everything is hunky-dory in the world. Egypt falls, we can defeat the West, everything else. It was not the most thought-out strategy. So along comes bin Laden with his new plan. And I'll talk more about al-Qaeda in a second. I just want to briefly note two ways in which the 9/11 environment has changed before doing so. The first is that Muslim regimes in the Middle East and North Africa had been pressing for the U.S. and the West to get more involved, to be more supportive during the 1990s of their crackdowns against these Islamist actors. And by and large, the West was not. That changed a little bit with some of the Egyptians after the 1998 bombings in East Africa. I'm happy to talk about that. But the point is that the U.S. was very lukewarm, as were various European regimes. After 9/11, they received all the support they asked for and more. And that enabled them to really press their own advantage. It also meant that revolutionary groups that had not been on board with AQ's agenda before 9/11, and most of them weren't, now had a reason to get on board with AQ's agenda, right? So understanding these dynamics between a state and its jihadist group, right, and the dynamics between the different jihadist groups is very important in terms of making decisions about where, and who the U.S. or other, Western governments is going to ally with. At the same time, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia had not been pressed to take action against these different actors to nearly the degree that they could have been during the 1990s. Pakistan did come under U.S. pressure at various times, and it did not have much of a relationship with the U.S. by the end of the 1990s. I'm happy to get into that. But after 9/11, they came under significantly more pressure to act, and this altered their relationships with indigenous jihadists, many of whom turned their guns on the state. So if before 9/11, in some ways, there was a great article that came out in 2002 in Foreign Affairs saying that the U.S. was caught up in someone else's civil war, after 9/11, some of these states became caught up in our global war on terrorism. And that's a really important switch in terms of jihadist-state relations. How are we doing on, we've got a couple, we've got on, all right, cool. So I'm going to talk through AQ. I'm not going to give its entire history, plenty of good books that I'm happy to recommend. I'm just going to hit the high points, especially in terms of how it engaged with the state, and then come to why this matters, and we'll do questions and answers. Again, just historically, it's important to remember that AQ is one of the few groups that is born not in its country of domicile, right? It's not, or in its country of origin. It is started by Saudis and Egyptians primarily, and you had some people from other states, in a guest house in Peshawar in Pakistan. So it's got a transnational roster as opposed to an ethnically homogenous one, and it's not born in the area where it operates, right? It's born in a truly transnational environment. And it was actually intended to be the nucleus for a sort of pseudo-global Muslim Islamist army, as I mentioned, that was going to go to different spots around the world and defend, Muslims in need. So in that regard, at its outset, the idea was Islamist, but it was pan-Islamist. It was not revolutionary. And I mentioned, of course, where you begin to get to see that turn with Saudi Arabia and bin Laden's projection of the situation there onto the other Arab regimes. You also had Egyptians who were at the forefront of revolutionary jihadism, who are believed to have encouraged this. There's recent new documents coming out that shed light on sort of how this ideology developed. And a lot of it is traced to a guy, Abu Walid al-Masri. It's not important. He's writing a lot of books now and very critical of AQ. But he essentially came up with what he termed the pack mule phenomenon, which was that the jihadist movement was like this sort of pack mule, and by forcing the by focusing on Arab states, it was loading itself down more and more, and that by focusing on the U.S., you could sort of like lift the burden and enable to. It's not a really perfect analogy, okay, but it was his analogy, and it got a lot of traction with bin Laden. It was in a letter to him when the U.S. was coming into Somalia, and like there's a lot of, it's very, in my world, it's very interesting. There's a lot of discussion of like this aha moment, and now, yes, we can relieve the burden on all of our jihadists in the Arab world by just focusing on the U.S. Again, underwear gnomes, right? I mean, it's not necessarily the most well thought out strategy. And most jihadists, by the way, are like not enamored with this. They're like, fuck. We may not be doing so well, but at least we're not fighting the superpower, okay? We're struggling against like the Egyptian regime or the Libyan regime. What, you want us to like go fight America now? I mean, there are all these discussions with people saying like they have satellites, I mean, they can find us anywhere. It's not a good idea, but they push forward. That said, during the early 1990s, there's a lot that's been written about al-Qaeda's base in Sudan. Bin Laden couldn't go back to Saudi Arabia because, he wanted to topple the regime, and they don't approve of that. And most of his Egyptian colleagues couldn't go back to Egypt because they wanted to topple the regime, and it's also not approved of. And so they were in Sudan at the invitation of the regime in Khartoum. All right? Now, a lot is written about AQ's building up of its base there, and the fact that during this time it was supporting numerous different, jihadist entities in the world. Far less is written about its relationship with the Sudanese state, which is really interesting. Okay, the 9/11 Commission refers to AQ as a stateless network, and yes, in some ways it is a stateless network. But let's look at its relationship and what it's doing in Sudan during the early 1990s. One, it's state building. All right, bin Laden's got a nice little exchange going on with the regime where he is using his construction equipment and investing his money to build infrastructure, and his businesses that he owns are getting kickbacks. He's investing millions of dollars in the Sudanese state to try to build up its infrastructure. His hosts have said, we're going to need some of your assistants, your men, for training, etc., to use against the separatists in the south. As we know, there's a long-running conflict in Sudan. Bin Laden is more than happy to make his people available. I mean, to me, that sounds very much like a state-sponsored group. All right? He also practices strategic restraint. his language becomes much more vitriolic against the US and Saudi Arabia after he leaves Sudan and goes to Afghanistan in 1996. I'll come to that hijra or migration in just one moment. During that time, he does engage the US in Somalia, right? AQ does. We now know that, yes, there were people on the ground who were providing training and that they were involved in the Black Hawk Down incident. Here's the thing, the regime in Khartoum encourages him to go do that. So it's not as though bin Laden is acting in contradiction to what the local state is looking for. All right? This isn't this sort of stateless, unbound by political contingencies actors. They are very much practicing strategic restraint. And memoirs that have come out recently by people who were with bin Laden at the time, including his personal secretary, are like, yeah, we really were thinking through, calculating what we could and could not get away with because of the power of the Sudanese state. Now, the problem with relying on states for safe haven or support or anything else is that they're fickle actors. And they are prone to making decisions based on broader geopolitical imperatives rather than, what Osama bin Laden wants. And so a series of events lead the Sudanese to basically pressure, come evict all of the different groups that are based there. And they go to Afghanistan. Afghanistan, of course, has been in civil war since the Soviets pulled out in 89. Some might argue that Afghanistan had actually been in civil war since 1979 when the Soviets arrived. In any event, most people would be familiar. The Taliban has emerged in roughly 1994. By the time bin Laden gets there, they are on the march. They don't yet control all of the country. They never would control all of the country, but they control most of it. They are seriously supported by the Pakistani state, which, by the way, is more than happy to help, arrange, introductions for bin Laden to some of these actors, and, is not averse to him getting set up in Afghanistan. But his relationship with the Afghan Taliban and with the state itself and al-Qaeda's relationship is very different than it was in Sudan for several reasons. One, bin Laden's been burned by the Sudanese. When he left, he lost millions of dollars that he'd invested. Now, the Sudanese regime was like sort of a cosmetically Islamist one. But the Taliban, they're like the real deal. They're trying to build an Islamic state. And there have been jihadists who have complained since that bin Laden draws all the wrong lessons from Sudan. The lessons that he draws are, forget my hosts, I don't care what their concerns are, I'm just going to go ahead and do what I want to do. And it's like just a couple months after he gets there that he issues his famous fatwa in 1996 declaring war against the US. The lesson that perhaps he should have drawn was, don't get into bed with, real politic actors in Sudan, but maybe consider working with the Taliban that's actually trying to build an Islamic state, if that's what if you truly care about building an Islamic state, because that's what they're trying to do. There's a lot of tension with the Taliban over the next couple of years. They continually try to restrain him. His 1998 fatwa, the World Islamic Front, that's very famous, is actually issued from areas that are not really under Taliban control. Because of his relations with the Taliban. Taliban is consistently considering chucking him out of the country. Meanwhile, the other jihadists that are there, which already don't like this war against America idea, also don't like the fact that what he's doing is putting the Taliban regime in jeopardy, because again, trying to build a real Islamic state. And the point that I'm hammering here on, in terms of that building an Islamic state, I'm doing that because we're going to fast forward in a few minutes, 10 years, and al-Qaeda's approach to Islamic state building is going to have changed. And it's going to be interesting to look at that trajectory. Before I do that, 9/11 happens. By the way, I'm skipping over a lot of history. I know that. I'm happy to get into it during discussion. 9/11 happens, and where is al-Qaeda and the state now? First, let me briefly define what we mean by AQ. There are two ways of looking at al-Qaeda. There's generally one way of looking at al-Qaeda, which I tend to think is the wrong way, and that's geographically. We talk about al-Qaeda core in Pakistan. That's the organization that attacked America on 9/11. We talk about its affiliate, AQAP in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, based in Yemen. We talk about its affiliate, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. We talk about its affiliate now, Shabab in Somalia. We talk about its affiliate, Islamic State of Iraq and of Sham, which is based in Iraq and / Syria now, and Jabhat al-Nusra, which is another. We'll get into Jabhat al-Nusra's relationship with ISIS in a minute. We talk about it in that way, geographically. I posit, and will be positing, that we should look at it from a genealogical perspective. What actors were part of AQ before 9/11 and what actors weren't. And that changes the way we look at al-Qaeda and raises really interesting questions in how it engages with different actors, its ideology, and the state. Al-Qaeda in Pakistan clearly was part of Al-Qaeda before 9/11, right? That's Zawahiri and until May 2011, bin Laden. But Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was also part of AQ before 9/11. It's led by Nasser al-Waheshi, who was bin Laden's personal secretary before 9/11. Okay? It is two groups, Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia and Al-Qaeda in Yemen, that have been merged, both of which were led by Al-Qaeda leaders that were part of the group before 9/11. So to me, to say that the core is in Pakistan and that AQAP is an affiliate is incorrect. Especially, by the way, because Waheshi, the leader of AQAP, is now the general manager for global operations. He's the number 2. So that's core. So when I talk about AQ core, what I'm talking about is the guys in Pakistan and the guys in Yemen. And that'll get really interesting in terms of how they each relate globally and to the states in which they're located. Al-Qaeda in Pakistan continues to pursue a global jihad against the U.S., although it hasn't launched a successful attack in the West since 2005. It began attacking the Pakistani state in 2003. Pakistan had been, it had had at least a tacit agreement with Al-Qaeda before 9/11, but quickly turns on it after 9/11. Turns on the Taliban too, but of course the Pakistani state then, helps the Taliban situate itself in tribal areas in Baluchistan and do an insurgency in Afghanistan. Whereas most of the senior AQ leaders who have been captured or killed, that's been in Pakistan with the assistance of the Pakistani state. And so Al-Qaeda in Pakistan is now involved in two broad sort of pursuits. One is rhetorically, at least, promoting global jihad against the U.S. and trying to manage a far-flung empire of affiliates. The other is it is increasingly waging a revolutionary jihad against the Pakistani state. The guys in Yemen are really interesting. They start out back in 2001, 2002, just attacking global targets. They only want to attack Western targets in Yemen. And they actually try to communicate to the police and security services, if you don't attack us, we're not going to attack you. We just want to kill the kuffar who happen to be based in Yemen, so just chill out. But, of course, President Bush has sat across from Yemeni President Saleh and said, look, if you don't go after al-Qaeda, we're going to put our special forces on the ground and they're going to go after al-Qaeda. And Saleh's like, oh okay. And so that changes the relationship between these actors. And what starts out as a global jihad quickly becomes a revolutionary one, because Bush says to Saleh, go after al-Qaeda. Saleh says to his security services, go after al-Qaeda. The security services go after al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's like, we told you not to come, we're not interested. Okay, fine. And now it's a revolutionary jihad, and it has been for the last 10 years. Saudi Arabia, it's similar effort, right? The overall objective when they launch operations there in 2003, which small coterie of leaders know, is we want to topple the state. But it's framed as this is a global jihad. And the targets that they start bombing are, again, U.S. military and defense targets. And again, they're saying to the Saudi security services, just leave us alone to do what we want to do, and it's all going to be okay. But of course, the Saudis are like, look, we can't have you blowing stuff up, so all right, now we have to crack down on you. And again, what starts out as a global jihad quickly becomes a revolutionary one. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, by the way, it's formed in 2009 from sort of the vestiges of the guys in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Unlike the folks in Pakistan that are ethnically heterogeneous and are in exile, the guys in Yemen are homogeneous and indigenous, okay? They are primarily Yemenis based in Yemen. And unlike the guys in Pakistan that are sort of like duck and cover fighting for their lives, the Yemeni al-Qaeda goes on the offensive and actually seizes territory. And this is where we get the advent of a really interesting development in terms of al-Qaeda. And I think, to me, one of the most interesting developments of the last couple of years, and a potential harbinger for the future that the U.S. will have to deal with. And that is the launch of Ansar al-Sharia. Ansar al-Sharia is essentially Yemeni AQAP above ground organization. Okay? It's still AQAP, but they don't have that name. And what do? They do social services. They do dawah. They engage with the local communities. They do all that state building stuff that al-Qaeda didn't have time for back in the 1990s. Okay? They're also fighting the Yemeni state, they want to fight the Saudi state, and they're launching strikes against the US. But this is a really important development. The Ansar al-Sharia development is really important, and it gets exported. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb is the AQ affiliate in North Africa and the Sahel. I haven't talked about them a lot. I'm not going to go into great detail about them today. Suffice it to say, they too now are working through different local actors that are at various stages of legitimacy in terms of the states in which they're based. There's an Ansar al-Sharia Tunisia. It's almost this cookie cutter sort of formula, right? Where you replicate it. And AQIM, we've intercepted messages. I'm not telling you anything that's not like classified. I read it in the AP, Associated Press reports. In which what the AQIM leaders have said to these various above-ground organizations is, look, we've already got the jihadist bullseye on our back, so let us handle the violence, and you guys are responsible for doing dawah and social services and engaging with the state in different ways. We see this in Syria as well, okay? And this is really interesting. The AQ associated group that forms there is called Jabhat al-Nusra, all right? And it is doing a lot of social services, dawah. They're administering like petroleum reserves when they take control of them. I mean, they are acting as, they're playing a state governance role. They have had a bit of a spat with the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham, which we often call just al-Qaeda in Iraq, over the fact that ISIS is a bunch of foreign fighters who've come in from Iraq and elsewhere who have far less interest in building, this sort of bond with the population. They just want to go kill things. And so you have two AQ affiliates that are at odds with one another over how they're going to engage with the state and the local population and what role they're going to play in that regard. And finally, I'll close by on the AQ piece by coming back to AQ in Pakistan. Bin Laden himself, in the 17 or 18 letters that have been released from the raid on the Abbottabad compound where he was killed, there are thousands more that we haven't seen. But in those that have been released, even he was beginning to talk. This guy who had no time for dawah or social services in the 1990s was beginning to talk about the importance of sort of capturing a little bit of territory and then rather than pressing the military advantage, seeking to try to build something there to show that the jihadists could actually govern. Okay? See, we're not just violent actors, we're also state builders. Zawahiri has continued to bang that drum. He's also focused more at the local and regional level, in large part because of the opportunities that have been created by the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring create these opportunities for engagement, for sort of pseudo state building, social services, etc. The revolutionary jihadists that existed in the 1980s and 90s, those who have been interviewed, who've come in from the cold, have said, we regret that when we had more opportunity to do so, that we didn't sort of try to forge greater ties with the local population. And so this suggests that jihadists, even those who want to topple the state, have learned from their mistakes. By the way, I should note, that I feel like their Pakistani brethren, the pan-Islamist Pakistani brethren, are sitting there being like, we've been doing this for like 30 years. Where were you guys? Right? But it's much easier, of course, when you've got the state behind you to engage in various types of above-ground activities than it is when you're opposed to the state. The final thing that I'll say about the guys in Pakistan is that they are becoming increasingly ethnically Pakistani. That's because we're killing a lot of the Arabs that are there. Okay? They're getting droned, or they're leaving to go to places like Syria or Yemen. And what's interesting is as more Pakistanis join AQ, surprise, surprise, their messaging about Pakistan and India has increased. Their messaging about fighting against the US and Arab regimes has decreased, which suggests that these guys who came from a very specific state environment bring that mentality with them, right? They bring that nationalist mentality with them. This idea that they are completely deterritorialized is well, it's wrong. I can think of other words, but it's wrong. And so we see even there a potential future indigenization of al-Qaeda in Pakistan. Now, why does this matter? It matters for a couple of reasons. One, it makes things much more complicated for local actors in terms of how they engage with these groups. And it makes things more complicated with us in terms of how we work with local allies. But it also means that these groups could bind themselves to more locally rooted environments and over time potentially pose less of a threat transnationally. I'm not saying they will, but they potentially could pose less of a threat transnationally because they are more invested in their local environments than they have been in the past. Why else is this important? Well, because our current CT strategy and understanding of the evolution of the threat has a lot to do with what's happening now. We certainly recognize that the threat is becoming more decentralized, more local, regional. But how are we approaching fighting these various groups? Well, we're using drones, yes, and we're using special operations forces raids occasionally, yes. But there are political constraints, domestic and international, on when and where we can use those. There are also legal constraints. The authorization for the use of military force that was passed after 9/11 authorizes the president to use force against those actors who were involved in or supported the 9/11 attacks. But we've had all these new groups that have formed that are not actually connected to sort of, the historical or original or genealogical al-Qaeda. And so there are questions about whether we can use unilateral force and in what instances we can use unilateral force. So what are we increasingly doing? Well, we're increasingly fighting al-Qaeda's affiliates, its associates, and other jihadist groups that we're concerned about via our allies. In other words, local states. We're good at portions of that, and we're bad at portions of that. We are really good at capacity building and intelligence sharing. If you need like a military built to know how to shoot straight and work in formation, then we are really good at that. And if you need intel sharing, well, we have a lot of intelligence to share with you. But we often fall short in several important respects. First, broadly, we fall short in aligning our CT strategy in general and the practices that I just discussed in particular with broader foreign policy goals in different areas, or accounting for local political dynamics. And that's where I think we really fall short, is in the politics piece. So yeah, great, we can build an army, but if we don't understand that army's relations to the jihadists, to the state, et cetera, then we're going to have problems. And we've seen that happen. We built the army in Mali that then launched a coup against the regime in Mali, forcing us to cut off capacity building, creating space for AQIM to come further into Mali, wash, rinse, repeat, etc. That's not to say that individually people in government don't have a good understanding of these dynamics. I talk with a lot of people in the IC. They all have a really good understanding of these dynamics. It's not to say that policymakers and practitioners individually don't have a good understanding of these dynamics. They do. It is to say that from a policy perspective, the way our policies are written and the way they are implemented are divergent. Okay? And that goes to sort of how we give aid, how we engage in states. And again, it goes to the fact that we, for a long time, even though we have recognized that these guys are unique and in some ways deterrable, we still treat these groups in many ways as too disconnected from local states. And we still look at the solution as being to make states stronger rather than to do sometimes the harder work of fixing the knotty political issues that are there. I'm happy to get into sort of more examples of what that looks like. I think that's a good jumping off point for discussion. I've talked long enough, so let me stop there. Thank you. Silence.
It's the visual image of underwear gnomes and al-Qaeda in the same
I know. Ever since I learned that it was in a slide for Petraeus, I was like, oh, I'm going to use that in every talk that I can if I get an opportunity. It's just too good. So anyway, yeah. Questions? Yes.
Hi there.
Hi.
I was wondering how you measure the strength of the links between al-Qaeda and its affiliates.
It's an excellent question, and the short answer is that there is no agreed upon way of measuring that strength, and that's actually an incredibly hotly debated concept, right, is whether there is real command and control. And I tend to think that a lot of this comes down to sort of what you define as control. From a military perspective, is there command and control? Absolutely not. Is there guidance and influence? Certainly there is. And it's helpful to ask, what does becoming an al-Qaeda affiliate? And I leave aside AQAP, right, because they're original al-Qaeda. They came with the ideology. What does becoming an affiliate mean? What does that entail? What do you have to do? Well, it means that you have to at least rhetorically add the US and its Western allies to your list of enemies. You're expected to engage in rhetorical unity, and you are expected to at least try to attack those targets within your sphere of influence, within your region. But you are largely left to your own devices in terms of how to do that. Zawahiri, when he issued public guidance earlier this year, it was the first time that al-Qaeda had ever issued such public guidance. And actually, a lot of us looked at it and we thought, well, the fact that Zawahiri is issuing guidance and then you read that guidance, and that guidance is all about unity is really important, and we all need to be on the same page, and we're all in this together, that this was actually potentially signifying the fact that he was concerned about fracturing and a lack of control over these different entities. Now again, that doesn't mean that they don't communicate. Some communicate more than others. There's more communication between AQ, it seems, in Pakistan and in Iraq, and AQ and AQAP than there is between AQ and the guys in the Maghreb or in Somalia. Whether that's because the guys in Pakistan are less invested in those theaters because it's harder to get messages out there. I mean, we don't know. There is communication. It is not nearly as constant as they would like. There's also broad guidance. But at the end of the day, al-Qaeda in the core al-Qaeda has put itself in a bind, right? It has essentially said, fine, you joining us means that you have to adopt our rhetoric and our sort of broader macro objectives. But it also means that we adopt yours. So whereas AQ didn't talk a lot about the Algerian regime, for example, before the Salafi group for preaching in combat joined and became al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, now it does. And so that for AQ dilutes its message as well. So there's togetherness. There is guidance, but there is not, I don't think, rigorous command and control. And occasionally, people, the AQ brand ends up on the hook for things that the leadership might not necessarily have liked. Yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between al-Qaeda and the Afghan Taliban? I think that the two are often conflated, at least in media. And that's a mistake, I think. The original relationship, like you were saying, was that of a host and a guest, and that's actually the reason why we went to war in Afghanistan, is that they refused to give up the guest.
Right. So that's another excellent question. Not just conflated by the media, actually conflated by George Tenet, former CIA director, when he sat down after 9/11. He said, "Oh, these guys are like in lockstep, one and the same." No, they were not. Now, the U.S. faced little choice at the end of the day about whether or not to go to war in Afghanistan. I would argue because Mullah Omar wasn't going to give up Osama bin Laden, but there was a lot of pushback within the Taliban. A lot of people did want to give up Osama bin Laden, and actually going back to '96. There had been debates, maybe 97, about whether or not they should hand him over. And there were a lot of actors, a lot of senior Taliban leaders who thought that they should hand bin Laden over. Mullah Omar is famously quoted to have said, "He's like a bone in my throat. I can't swallow him and I can't spit him out." He didn't want to hand over a Muslim to an infidel for a whole host of reasons. But he also didn't like having him around. And certainly since 9/11, I would argue that I don't think that the relationship has gotten that much. I think there's tactical cooperation. That's my sense from the evidence that I've seen. Certainly the advent of suicide bombing in Afghanistan, which was unheard of in the region before, and that's got AQ written all over it. And AQ helped the Taliban to develop its media enterprise. The Taliban, media relations was not nearly what it was, 10 years ago. They're on Twitter now. They're making videos. A lot of this comes from AQ Media Relations providing that assistance. But this is actors in the same trench. This is not necessarily uniformity. And the truth is that in 2002. The Taliban might have sort of slinked back into Afghanistan had they been given, some sort of seat at the table. And the Haqqanis actually sent an emissary to Kabul. The Haqqani network is an arm of the Taliban, although loosely connected to it in some regards in terms of they don't always follow in lockstep. But anyway, they sent an emissary, to say, to sort of suss things out and take a role in the government. And he was actually beaten up and sent home. Right? The Haqqanis, that's, by the way, the territory, they controlled the territory where bin Laden issued his famous 98 fatwa. That's where the AQ training camps were. So AQ and Haqqanis were really close. But even the Haqqanis were prepared to sort of, look for some sort of a peace. They weren't given that welcome. And so now, all these guys are fighters in the same trench, but they have different objectives. I would finish with this, which is that in the event that AQ becomes more and more Pakistani rather than more and more Arab, that will also change the relationship as well, right? In some ways, for the better, because you're dealing with people from the same local environment, but in some ways, for the worse, because the Afghan Taliban really don't like the Pakistanis. They are really, they're kind of under the ISI's thumb. So, and there's debates and distinctions between them as well. So it's a very complicated relationship. If you're interested in more on this, I would highly recommend a book called An Enemy Recreated. It's by two researchers who lived in Kandahar from 2006 to 2012. Two Western researchers, a guy from Germany and a guy from the Netherlands, I think, like a little like my age. And they lived there. They lived in Kandahar, and they engaged with the Taliban a lot, and they interviewed them a lot. And they're not sympathizers, but they've written, I think, a really important book that just sort of lays out, and by the way, and is very critical of the Taliban, but also lays out its relationship with AQ. Yes, sir.
On the topic of recruitment, it seems like there's at least a couple narratives that al-Qaeda recruits, like rural young men, not as educated, but then they also are recruiting like educated Muslims in the West. And I guess I'm curious, what is the U.S. or the West doing to try to counter or negate that kind of recruitment?
Okay.
What are some things that have been working?
So two questions there, both good. First, let me talk about AQ recruitment, because it differs based on where they operate. First of all, it's important to note that historical AQ before 9/11 was never more than like 120, 150 guys, maximum. They trained thousands but they only recruited select individuals that had special skills that they thought were going to be useful to them. So, there was one author sort of said, like, going to Afghanistan was like going to college, but getting into AQ was like going to Harvard Law. I mean, they're like the creme de la creme, which I think gives AQ too much credit and should be offensive to Harvard. But anyway, be that as it may. So that's important. Post 9/11, right? Recruitment differs based on where you are. So AQ in Pakistan, of course, has often sought to work through local Pakistani groups to recruit members of the Pakistani diaspora, people living in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, people who have visas, right? Or who have citizenship in the West and can therefore execute plots there. And we saw that with the guys who were responsible for the 7/7 attacks in 2005, the thwarted bombing in 2006 with the liquid explosives on the plane, the reasons why all of you can't bring shampoo through airport, not a problem for me. So that's, and in Pakistan now, they actually tangle with a group that I follow quite closely, Lashkar-e-Taiba, because they're both interested in recruiting tech-savvy urban Pakistanis, right? They're both looking for sort of that higher-level smart guy. They're not recruiting a lot of rural poor because they don't need to, because they're not waging an insurgency. There's like a handful of AQ guys in Afghanistan, and that's it, right? And they're their embedded advisors with the Taliban or what have you. Again, that operational connection. Now, in the Maghreb and the Sahel, they're recruiting like a lot of poor kids from Algeria, also from Mauritania, where the state cracked down on, again, we talk about state actions, right? State cracked down on a lot of reformist Salafis back in 2003, put them all in prison, then let a bunch of them out in 2004, 2005. First thing, like those guys do, 100, 150 of them head north to Mali and link up with AQ elements there. Okay, so certainly in those cases, that's more of a rural issue. Yemen, they recruit from urban areas, but they also recruit from tribes. One of the criticisms of the drone campaign in Yemen is that whereas in Pakistan, if you kill an AQ member with a drone, it's unlikely that AQ is going to recruit the family of any innocents that were there or anybody else killed, right? Although that certainly happens for the Haqqanis, Tariqi Taliban Pakistan, Afghan Taliban, and others. In Yemen, if you kill an AQ member, you've also killed somebody's father, son, brother, etc. And so that is a recruitment mechanism there. Shabab was recruiting. Locally, it was also a lot on Twitter, and it recruited members of the Somali diaspora from the West. That was a big concern. It's a long answer, but it's to say that recruitment's variegated. Depends on where you are, right? What are we doing about it? Well, we're spending a lot of money. We've got a huge CVE program. We recently engaged in sort of like a global forum with Turkey and others where we're going to pool some of our resources, which I think is a good thing. I think the more resources can be pooled, the better. But the truth is we're spending a lot of money on countering violent extremism without, in my humble opinion, without necessarily having real metrics to be able to measure what it is or what we are or are not succeeding in doing, and without necessarily knowing, diagnosing the problem specifically enough. And we run the risk here in the US, I think, of potentially, and this gets into sort of policy prescriptions and politics, and so I'm, as an academic, careful of that, but I do think it runs the risk of isolating communities, right? Of saying, if you run to a Muslim community, you're like, don't be jihadist, and they're like, what are you talking about, right? I mean, you have those dangers, and there are people like Will McCants at the Brookings Institute, who was a senior advisor at State, who worked on putting together their CVE program, and now, like, I had him into my class a couple weeks ago so that he could just ruthlessly criticize it, because what ended up coming out was not what all the experts sort of tried to feed into it. There are a lot of problems with it from a metrics perspective. You can't also convince people not to think a certain way, right? So you really need to decide whether you want to focus on people who are at risk of going into violence, who are already involved in violence, or who are just sort of supportive of it verbally, but aren't necessarily going to cross that border. And that's very difficult, right, to know when that's going to happen. So I'm not saying it's easy. What I'm saying right now is we've been spending a lot of money. We're still looking for the right solution. I don't necessarily know that we've hit on it yet. I also personally, if you look at the data, it's questionable how big of a phenomenon it really is, right? I mean, we had the Boston bombers last year, and that was tragic. We had the Fort Hood shooting, but it's important to keep these things in perspective vis-a-vis a lot of the other security challenges that the U.S. faces. Yes, ma'am.
That's a segue into my question.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could react to the President Obama's speech at the National Defense University in May, where he talked about how the core al-Qaeda is now so
Oh, it's on wheels. Yeah.
Demolished.
Yeah.
Because for a better word, that we could foresee a time where we might change our strategy and stop pursuing permanent war.
I think we're going to have to. First of all, I would agree that we've decimated AQ in Pakistan. Because of the way I look at AQ, I would say we've not necessarily decimated the core al-Qaeda organization. People in my community increasingly, I'm a South Asia watcher. I work on South Asia issues, but I'm more than happy to be like, look, I think Yemen is increasingly the sort of the center of gravity for AQ core at this point, right? I think once if you have, who's in Pakistan right now? I mean, I wouldn't expect anybody to know the names. It's Zawahiri. It's a guy by the name of Shukr Juma, who is an American. It's Adam Gadan, who's an American. Saif al-Adil, I think, who's been with them since the 90s, might still be in Iran. The playing cards of the people in Pakistan who were core AQ, we're running low. And so increasingly, you see the shift to Yemen. And with Haiti's promotion, I think that's certainly the case. So I think still progress needs to be made in Yemen, although they haven't been able to really attempt a transnational plot for several years now. The most recent one was actually a Saudi plan to move things along and then shut down. So we're making progress on that front too, although I think Yemen will still be a basket case for a while. And so I tend to look at this, and the guys in my class will be familiar with this, I tend to think we need to look at the threat, we need to break down the threat to answer the question about permanent war. And I break it down in terms of threats to the homeland, which I think it would be naive to say that they disappeared, but it would be disingenuous to say that they have not greatly reduced. And to my mind, anybody who doesn't agree that they have greatly reduced, sorry to put my own sort of opinions on the table, I think there's a bit of fear-mongering going on there. They've greatly reduced. Then there's the threat to U.S. civilians and infrastructure overseas. And I think that is going to be the threat for the foreseeable future. But I'm not necessarily sure that a permanent war footing is warranted for that. And then finally, there's the threat to U.S. interests. And in that regard, I think we need to re-examine how we understand sort of the jihadist phenomenon. I, for sort of a long time, backed away from kind of, pounding the al-Qaeda drum too loud because I didn't want to be seen as I'm trying to sell my book or anything, but I'm trying to get over that. Because at the end of the day, what should be of greater concern to the United States? The potential for a small-scale terrorist attack by AQAP against some sort of U.S. entity in the area, or LET launching another major attack against India and starting a war between two nuclear powers, potentially, right? To me, from a U.S. interest perspective, the latter is a bigger problem. Similarly, I don't think the minute that you've eliminated AQAP's transnational, power projection capabilities, the threat disappears, because they may still pose a threat to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, right? Which, although we're going through kind of a bumpy time in terms of our alliance right now, we still don't want to see destabilized. One of the reasons why the guys in Yemen were able to get off the map before is because once we thought we'd sort of killed the transnational problem, we backed off. But if you're going to continue to sort of focus on this issue for the foreseeable future, which I think we'll have to, because I think jihadist violence will be here for the foreseeable future, then you need a more sustainable counterterrorism architecture than that which currently exists. The AUMF, for legal reasons, is not necessarily going to have applicability to all of these problems. And from an international norms perspective, drones are not necessarily the answer, leaving aside all the sort of other domestic legalities that we have. So if you look from a legal, from a geopolitical, from a financial perspective, this is not sustainable. So I think he's right that we're going to have to move off of this permanent war footing. To my mind, that will require continuing to work through local allies, but we're going to have to be smarter about how we do it. Again, I come back to, this is not a condemnation of the individuals who are responsible for these programs, because a lot of these people are my colleagues, they're my friends, but institutionally, we are too prone to focus on capacity building in sort of the military sector, or to go entirely in the other direction and think that we have to nation build, as opposed to really doing the hard work of understanding the politics and synchronizing our CT engagement with that politics. And that's not to say that people don't understand the politics. It is to say that, again, institutionally, it doesn't always work out in terms of the planning process. And I mean, I'll just give you one example. On the NSS, there are CT people and there are regional people. And sometimes for reasons of classification and clearances, the CT people will be sitting in the room by themselves, planning what they're going to do in X place without the regional folks there to give input, right? I mean, that's those kind of barriers. We've broken down barriers between the different intelligence agencies, but there are still barriers between the guys who do the politics, the guys who do the intel, and the guys who do the fighting. And to be sustainable, that's a problem we have to wrestle with. Yes, and then mine.
Okay. Is there any sort of conflict between the developing Pakistani identity and the AQAP, different affiliates? Is there any sort of potential conflict between those two groups?
No, but there could be. First, because Arabs are racist. I mean, I'm speaking like writ large, like Arab jihadists are racist. They would never follow a Pakistani emir, right? So if Zawahiri gets dead, I can't think of the Arab who's in Pakistan who's going to replace him. But that you could foresee in al-Qaeda in Pakistan, right? That then answers to the guys in Yemen. You also do get beyond that. You get some conflicts at the ground level between just in terms of where to focus, right? And this is arbitrage. And we're focusing more on India and Pakistan, partially because more Pakistanis are coming in, but also because we don't want to completely isolate ourselves from the other groups that are here, that are focused on India and Pakistan. And so a lot of that is just sort of arbitrage and engagement. I don't necessarily see a big conflict ensuing, but I do see potentially, if Zawahiri were to meet his maker, that you would see, unless there would be another Arab who could step up in Pakistan. I would say the core is not in just one geographic location, and it would probably be the Yemeni guys who would lead it. Or you would get just a much greater sort of decentralization of authority overall.
So that changing identity can only go so far in Pakistan. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, I mean the changing identity, so long as the Arab leaders are alive, I mean, so long as Zawahiri's alive, he's in charge. That's the way AQ works, right? He's not going to be deposed. But once he dies, it's questionable whether his successor would come from Pakistan, because it would be very difficult to imagine a Pakistani in charge of the global jihad. People ask me all the time about Lashkar-e-Taiba, do you think they could ever step up and lead the global jihad? I'm like, no. Like, leaving aside all the other, they're like pan-Islamist, pro-state-centric, in bed with the ISI, leaving aside all of those other things, I just can't see guys in like Yemen or Algeria taking orders from Pakistanis. Like, if you look at their writings, they again and again and again talk about the importance of the heart of the Arab world, right, and the Gulf. Hey, Mana.
Hello. Thank you. I've enjoyed this very much. I recently read a scholar from SIS, actually, who was arguing that the real problem of the Middle East and the future problems aren't the jihadist problems or revolutions, it's going to be the Sunni-Shiite conflict. And that's the future, and it's really scary because the U.S. is going to be completely sidelined, and there's going to be very little that the U.S. can do. It's just going to be watching from the margins. So what thoughts do you have?
Yeah, I would, first of all, I would agree that I think the Sunni-Shia conflict is going to be one of the major conflicts in the region, in the future, and that the U.S. leverage and influence will be limited. I think the U.S. leverage, I already think that U.S. leverage and influence in the region is more limited than in the past, and that's something that a lot of people who follow the Middle East more closely than I have been, I think, writing for like the last 6 months or a year, sort of the limits on our influence in the Middle East, and the fact that also our interests aren't in the Middle East to the same degree that they used to, right? Because for a whole host of reasons, as AQ weakens, as our own oil production gets stronger, as China rises, for a whole host of reasons, we can't seem to get out of the Middle East, and it's all you read about in the newspapers. But at the same time, if you actually step back, a lot of our interests are not in the Middle East, and we do have limited leverage. I would accept what that scholar in SIS said, but with a caveat, which is I think that the jihadists will play an important sort of exacerbator come shaper role, or shaper come exacerbator role in the Sunni-Shia conflict in ways that will be very difficult for us to predict. But I will point to, I think, one very, very interesting trend in terms of jihadist currents or causes or objectives or rationales for activism, or whatever you want to call it, which is the two that I talked about during the 1990s, right, were revolutionary and pan-Islamist, and then you had global sort of join those twain. If you look a lot at what's been happening over the last several years, you have, there's always been an anti-Shia element to that too, but it's been tamped down. And AQ tried to tamp it down. Bin Laden's approach to the Shia was, yes, they're heretics and we have to kill them, but like later. Let's all get along right now. Let's be ecumenical. I mean, the guy even AQ trained with Hezbollah in the early 1990s for like 5 minutes. They learned how to do vehicle-borne suicide bombings, and they were like, thank you very much, we're good. But if you look at Syria, what you have there, you have a mix of sectarian jihad against the Shia, right, and revolutionary jihad against an impious Muslim ruler. If you look at what's happening in Iraq, same thing, right? This is a revolutionary jihad, but it's a revolutionary jihad against a Shia ruler by Sunni jihadists. If you look at Pakistan, where there's always been sectarian violence, going back to the 1990s, state-supported in some instances, sectarian jihadists in Pakistan, anti-Shia folks, play a predominantly important role in the revolutionary jihad that's being waged there. In part because they got cracked down on harder than a lot of other groups after 9/11, because the Pakistani state was looking for somebody to crack down on. These guys were like an embarrassment, so it's natural that and they have a history of attacking the state, so it's natural that they're now part of that revolutionary jihad. But the point is that you're seeing a blend of sectarian anti-Shia violence and revolutionary violence coming together, and I think that is going to be an important trend going forward, because as we've seen in Syria, it's a complicated enough mess as it is. When you then layer in the fact that Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS are on the ground, it becomes that much more complicated, right? Same thing with Iraq. So I think that conflict is going to be a major problem. But I would say that jihadists will be a part, although by no means the biggest part of it. Yes?
I have a question about AQAM,
Yes.
especially in northern Mali, and the fact that we kind of know that the dynamics of the power goes from the state failure and then you have it in the state. But what's their dynamic? Are they there for like to follow inside Sharia, to follow the fact that communities have to be empowered, or
why are they there?
Yes, or is it more like a revolutionary jihadist, and what's the role of the state and then the international communities? Like, is it just within the country, or?
No, that's so the Mali dynamic for AQIM is to me encapsulates a lot of these trends. So first we need to go back and we need to say that AQIM, back when it was the GSPC, was recruiting people from southern Algeria, which bumps up against northern Mali, right? So they were bringing in people from that region back in the early 1990s, before they were even the Salafi group for preaching combat, when they were another group that they'd since split off from. By the end of the 1990s, the GSPC, AQIM's sort of precursor, is on the back foot, and they're being pushed further into the south. And they expand there initially because that's a logistical supply line, and because they've recruited people from the region, and so they might as well make use of them, right? But increasingly, Mali, ungoverned spaces in northern Mali looks appealing, especially as AQIM becomes less appealing terrain. And then when you have the first of several coups there, and U.S. aid to Mali stops initially, and you have the several Tuareg rebellions that take place during the middle of the last decade, the army pulls out of there and creates a vacuum. Not that there was much in northern Mali to begin with, other than the Tuareg, which is a local ethnic group. And AQIM comes in, and they work really hard to situate themselves within the local fabric. They're not attacking the Mali regime. They do a lot in terms of kidnappings. People have seen that. They've raised anywhere between $20 and $60 million from kidnapping Westerners. And they sink a lot of that back into the local population. People marry into Tuareg tribes, things like that. They sort of root themselves in Mali. And they have what I would term a sort of tacit non-aggression pact, where the Malian regime is not going to attack them, because their feeling is basically like, it's somebody else's problem, and we got enough problems of our own. And AQIM is not going to attack the Malian regime, because they're like, look, you're not attacking us, we're not attacking you, and we're more focused on Algeria and increasingly on Mauritania, because they're a local Muslim country that recognizes Israel, and so they're like a sweet target. Plus, we got all these guys that we recruited from Mauritania a couple of years ago, and we got to do something with them. So they have a tacit non-aggression pact with Mali. By the way, the Malian regime also skimming some of that money from kidnapping, which is like another element, right? Corrupt regime. There was a really embarrassing event several years ago when the president's wife was allegedly arrested in Europe, spending euros that were marked from a kidnapping exchange. So, and let me wrap up on this to say that when the Tuareg, so the Arab Spring happens, right? Libya, Gaddafi falls. A lot of Tuareg have been fighting as part of Gaddafi's militias, all right? And a lot of them come back to Mali, and they bring a lot of weapons from Libya with them, and that's where you get the most recent Tuareg uprising. You get AQIM working sort of piggybacks off of a local Tuareg rebellion, and you have Ansar ad-Din, which is a local Islamist Tuareg group. You also have the MLNA, which is not Islamist Tuareg group. And AQIM, we've got letters from the head of AQIM basically saying to these guys, listen, don't try to build a jihadist state. Work with everybody. Work with everybody. Don't cut anybody's hands off. This is our chance. Everybody chillax. Okay, it's going to be fine. We're ultimately, yes, we're going to have to go after the heathen Tuaregs and all the other bad people. But first, we're going to take a go slow approach. His guys on the ground are like, I am not taking a go slow approach. And they ultimately march further south, right, towards Bamako, the head of Mali, inviting the French intervention and losing their safe haven that they had worked so hard to carve out in Mali. But that's what they were looking for. They were looking for first a safe haven, and then they piggybacked to actually try to do some state building, and then they lost the plot along the way.
So what I take from this is a couple years ago when I postponed my Mali travel plans, I probably shouldn't have done that because it's not going to get better anytime soon.
Probably not, although I don't know when you were planning to go to Mali, but they've been kidnapping people there since like 2007 or 8, so yeah.
Harder to ignore now.
Yes, it's harder to ignore now. And we don't pay.
That is also part of my concern.
We don't pay. If you're French or like Swiss and you're kidnapped, it's okay, but we don't pay.
Right, more to that in the end where gnomes will have a big influence. So this was an amazingly detailed, not just detailed talk about these groups, but within your talk, there were all these clues about how to stop treating these groups as just a bunch of jihadists, right? And to use where they are and what they're doing to understand exactly more their goals and how they're going to work. So please join me in thanking Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you. I also have to be rude and say, because this room is now booked at 5, would you talk to him in the lobby?